Concluding Camillus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. In politics, with the patricians, who indeed had only put him forward now out of envy, that if successful he might crush the people, or failing be crushed himself. However, to provide as good a remedy as he could for the present, knowing the day on which the tribunes of the people intended to prefer the law, he appointed it by proclamation for a general muster, and called the people from the forum into the campus, threatening to set heavy fines upon such as should not obey. On the other side, the tribunes of the people met his threats by solemnly protesting that they would fine him in 50,000 drachmas of silver if he persisted in obstructing the people from giving their suffrages for the law. Whether it were then that he feared another banishment or condemnation which would ill become his age and past great actions, or found himself unable to stem the current of the multitude, which ran strong and violent, he betook himself for the present to his house, and afterwards, for some days together, professing sickness, finally laid down his dictatorship. The Senate created another dictator, who chose Stolo, leader of the sedition, to be his general of horse, suffered that law to be enacted and ratified, which was most grievous to the patricians, namely, that no person whatsoever should possess above 500 acres of land. Stolo was much distinguished by victory he had gained, but not long after was found himself to possess more than he had allowed to others, and suffered the penalties of his own law. And now, the contention about election of consuls coming on, which was the main point and original cause of the dissension, and had throughout furnished most matter of division between the Senate and the people. Certain intelligence arrived. The Gauls again, proceeding from the Adriatic Sea, were marching in vast numbers upon Rome. On the very heels of the report followed manifest acts also of hostility. The country through which they marched was all wasted, and such as by flight could not make their escape to Rome were dispersing and scattering among the mountains. The terror of this war quieted the sedition. Nobles and commons, senate and people together, unanimously chose Camillus, the 5th time dictator, who, though very aged, not wanting much of 80 years, yet considering the danger and necessity of his country, did not as before pretend sickness or depreciate his own capacity, but at once took the charge and enrolled soldiers, and knowing that the great force of the barbarians lay chiefly in their swords, with which they laid about them in a rude and inarticulate matter. Okay. Hacking and hewing the head and shoulders, he caused headpieces entire of iron to be made for most of his men, smoothing and polishing the outside, that the enemy's swords, lighting upon them, might either slide off or be broken, and fitted also their shields with a little rim of brass, the wood itself not being sufficient to bear off the blows. Besides, he taught his soldiers to use their long javelins in close encounter, and by bringing them under their enemies' swords to receive their strokes upon them, when the Gauls drew near about the river Anium, dragging a heavy camp after them, and loaded with infinite spoil, Camillus drew forth his forces, and planted himself upon a hill of easy ascent, which had many dips in it, with the object that the greatest of his army might lay concealed, and those who appeared might be thought to have betaken themselves through fear to those upper grounds, and the more to increase this opinion in them, he suffered them, without any disturbance, to spoil and pillage, even to his very trenches, keeping himself quiet within his works, which were well fortified, till at last, perceiving that part of the enemy were scattered about the country foraging, and those that were in the camp did nothing day and night but drink and revel, in the night time he drew up his lightest armed men, and sent them out before to impede the enemy while forming into order, and to harass them when they should first issue out of their camp, and early in the morning brought down his main body, and set them in battle array in the lower grounds, a numerous and courageous army, not, as the barbarians had supposed, an inconsiderable and fearful division. The first thing that shook the courage of the Gauls was, that their enemies had, contrary to their expectation, the honor of being aggressors. In the next place, the light-armed men, falling upon them before they could get in their usual order, arranged themselves in their proper squadrons, so disturbed and pressed upon them that they were obliged to fight at random, without any order at all. But at last, when Camillus brought on his heavy armed legions, the barbarians, with their swords drawn, went vigorously to engage them. The Romans, however, opposing their javelins, and receiving the force of their blows on those parts of their defences which were well guarded with steel, turned the edge of their weapons, being made of soft and ill-tempered metal, so that their swords bent and doubled up in their hands, and their shields were pierced through and through, and grew heavy with the javelins that struck upon them, and thus, forced to quit their own weapons, they endeavored to take advantage of those of their enemies, laid hold of the javelins with their hands, and tried to pluck them away. But the Romans, perceiving them now naked and defenseless, betook themselves to their swords, which they so well used that in a little time great slaughter was made in the foremost ranks, while the rest fled over all parts of the level country. The hills and upper grounds Camillus had secured beforehand, and their camp they knew it would be difficult for the enemy to take, as, through confidence of victory, they had left it unguarded. This fight, it is stated, was 13 years after the sacking of Rome, and from henceforward the Romans took courage, and surmounted the apprehensions they had hitherto entertained of the barbarians, whose previous defeat they had attributed rather to pestilence and a concurrence of mischances than to their own superior valor. And indeed this fear had been formerly so great that they made a law that priests should be excused from service in war, unless in an invasion from the Gaul. This was the last military action that ever Camillus performed, for the voluntary surrender of the city of the Velitrani was but a mere accessory to it. But the greatest of all civil contests, and the hardest to be managed, was to be fought out against the people, who, returning home full of victory and success, insisted, contrary to the established law, to have one of the consuls chosen out of their own body. The Senate strongly opposed it, and would not suffer Camillus to lay down his dictatorship, thinking that, under the shelter of his great name and authority, they should be better able to contend for the power of his aristocracy. But when Camillus was sitting upon the tribunal, dispatching public affairs as an officer sent by the tribunes of the people, commanded him to rise and follow him, laying his hand upon him as ready to seize and carry him away, upon which such a noise and tumult as was never heard before filled the whole forum, some that were about Camillus thrusting the officer from the bench, and the multitude below calling out to him to bring Camillus down. Being at a loss what to do in these difficulties, he laid not down his authority, but, taking the senators along with him, he went to the Senate house. But before he entered, besought the entities that they would bring these troubles to a happy conclusion, solemnly vowing, when the tumult was ended, to build a temple to Concord. A great conflict of opposite opinions arose in the Senate, but at last the most moderate and most acceptable to the people prevailed, and consent was given that 2 consuls, one should be chosen from the commonalty. When the dictator proclaimed this determination of the Senate to the people, at the moment pleased and reconciled with the Senate, as indeed could not otherwise be, they accompanied Camillus home, with all expressions and acclamations of joy. The next day, assembling together, they voted a temple of Concord to be built according to Camillus's vow, facing the assembly and the forum, and to the feasts called the Latin holidays they added 1 day more, making 4 in all, and ordered that on the present occasion the whole people of Rome should sacrifice with garlands on their heads. In the election of the consuls, held by Camillus, Marcus Aemilius was chosen of the patricians, and Lucius Sextius the first of the commonalty, and this was the last of all Camillus's actions. In the year following, a pestilential sickness infected Rome, which, besides an infinite number of common people, swept away most of the magistrates, among whom was Camillus, whose death cannot be called immature if we consider his great age or greater actions, yet he was more lamented than all the rest put together that died than of that distemper. And one of the things that we find is that these whatever's thought to be a god or a goddess is often, how things turn out in a certain situation, or whether an entity as such maintains being thought that way among the people.